Hello, this is the Watchdog, and welcome back to Fun with Watches. If watches weren't fun, you'd only need one. Today, instead of doing a full review, we're going to do a comparison of a $10 George 28/2049 BKG versus a Curren 8106, which costs about $13 on AliExpress. Let's start out with the wrist check. I'm still wearing this Olive's 9923 Starfield watch. And Grogu is wearing my Sanda 3118. Grogu said that Han Solo bought a Rolex Deep Sea Challenge watch and he was bragging to Lando how deep he can go. Lando laughed at him and said Omega is working on a watch that will survive the Naboo planet core. Then Han said Rolex will make one that can survive a black hole. Lando said it better be a chronograph. Han said, why? Lando said, because in a black hole, time stops. All right, let's take a look at the watches. This is the $10 George watch, and this is the $13 Curren watch. They are both basic quartz three-handers, and they're both black, although the Curren is shiny. This one's matted, and this one has a date. This one does not. Other than that, they're fairly similarly sized, and so we will compare the two. On my channel, I tend not to badmouth watches, no matter how cheap, because I try to keep my channel fun and optimistic. But I found myself guilty of badmouthing the Walmart George with a lowercase g brand due to their many watches with fake subdials, pushers, and timing bezels. A while back, one of my viewers mentioned their basic three-handers weren't so bad, and I realized I shouldn't badmouth anything I've never actually owned. So I decided to shell out the $10 for a George watch. There was no way I was going to buy anything with the fake stuff, so I bought this three-hander instead. Rather than doing a proper review, I decided to compare it to this $13 Curren that I got from AliExpress. They are not similar in style, but they are in price. George does make watches that do look a bit more like this Curren, and I wish I would have bought one of those instead, just for this comparison purpose. But I do not want to waste another $10 on a George, so this is the one I have. The George is a 42 millimeter, and the Curren's a 40, and they're both about 9 millimeters thick. But the George has inverted end links, so it will wear a hair smaller than 42 would imply. But the Curren is a bit heavier at 102 grams, and the George is 92. And both of them have fake end links, so the lug width doesn't really apply because you can't change the bracelets. Then they both have fairly plain dials. The Curren actually has some writing on it. It has the Curren name in quartz, where the George doesn't say anything. I guess they're not proud of being a George. I don't know. And there's no mention of water resistance. They both have the basic 30. They both have plain baton indices. Basically, the George, though, has a double on top, and the Curren just has one that's just a hair thicker on top. Then the George, though, has a chapter ring, where the Curren does not even minute markers. So the George will be a little bit easier to set, because at least you have minutes between the indices. I don't know why they bothered with the seconds, the sub-seconds, though. That's just not really necessary, especially on a quartz watch. Then the Curren has Dauphine hands, and then the George has stick hands with a little bit of lume. We will compare the lume later of the George. There is no lume on this Curren. And it looks like they both have pretty thin second hands. And let's see, the George actually seems to hit the marks pretty good. Seems to miss, misses the 12 o'clock, but hits all the other ones. And the Curren seems to be hitting it pretty good too. Yeah, the Curren's hitting the marks pretty good. So they're both not bad when it comes to hitting the marks. They both have similarly sized push-pull crowns, but the George didn't bother making theirs black, which is kind of a mistake. I think it would have been better to have a black crown like the Curren. No, they're both push-pull, no screw downs here. You only have the basic 30 meters water resistance. Then they both have flat glass crystals. You're never going to get sapphire on a $10 watch. Then both have, these are not steel cases, they're both in alloy. They both have press-on case backs. This one says stainless steel back, which is a pretty good tell that the rest of the watch is not. And this one actually says Japan movement, and the Curren does not. It has a Chinese movement. So let's go ahead and look at the Curren case back. As you can see, the Curren case back has the name and logo and the model number here. So Curren's a little bit prouder of being a Curren than George is of being a George. But yeah, they're both press-ons. The George has a Japanese movement. The Curren has a Chinese movement. Usually when it comes to cheap quartz watches, the biggest issue is the crown action and setting it. So let's compare both of them. We'll do the George first. Let's go ahead and move the minute hand. And it looks like it's pretty loose and sloppy, but what happens when we press in the crown? It looks like it jumped just a little bit, which is disappointing since this is a Japanese movement. Yeah, so you're going to have to be careful when you set the George. Let's try the Curren. And this one's pretty loose too. So let's try what happens when you press in the crown. And oh, you get a big jump there too. So they both got very loose crown action, and they jump when you press them in, which is always a pain because that makes setting difficult. Both of them have 3-link hollow link bracelets, and both of them have fake end links, so you cannot change the bracelets on these watches. And but the Curren though does a much better job of hiding the fact that they're hollow links. You actually have to look for the seams, where the George is quite obvious that they're actually, the George, they're not hollow, they're rolled, unlike the Curren. And then where the Curren has traditional push pins to remove the sizing links, the George has these like kind of little pegs here, right there on the end. Both watches have simple press clasps and no micro adjust, but at least the Curren, the clasp matches the bracelet. The George does not. I think that was a pretty sloppy mistake there, not making this black to match it. Here's the George on my 7.5-inch wrist, and I removed absolutely no links to make this fit. So if you have a wrist bigger than 7.5, you will not be able to wear this, so don't bother because you can't change the bracelet. Here's the Curren on my 7.5-inch wrist. I had to remove one link to fit, so if you have a wrist bigger than 7 3/4, don't bother because you can't change the bracelet. Here we are in the loom room. The Curren doesn't have loom, so we will just test the George. The George loom is so bad that I don't even have to speed up the time to watch it fade. And in all honesty, if I sped up time, it would be gone in an instant. I reviewed a Fengine once and said it had the worst loom I had ever tested. Well, this George makes that Fengine seem like a Seiko. I don't think this George will ever be beaten because I think it is physically impossible to make worse loom. I think the Curren wins by just not participating. So that's it. I compared the George to the Curren, and the Curren is obviously a much better watch for only $3 more. So basically, I was always bad-mouthing George watches, And now, since I've actually owned one and looked at one, I kind of earned that right to do so now, because yeah, it's not a very good watch. So rather than spend $10 at Walmart for one of these Georges, you're better off spending $13 at AliExpress for something a little bit better. Yes, you'll have to wait longer because George is at your local Walmart. You can just go pick it up. Where AliExpress, you have to order it. It could take 2 to 3 weeks, but you're still getting a better watch. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it tells the time, but that's about all you can say about it. Well, thank you for watching my comparison of a George versus a Curren, and I will be back with another proper review. Be sure and like and subscribe to my channel. Bye.